I can set the background for you to help you answer that question very easily. The first verse of this chapter, before we get to our text, in verse number 1, one Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat at the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. I think most of you can figure that out. Why was he being watched? They were his critics. They were looking for something that he would say or do for which they would criticize him. I suspect you remember that through the 3 years of Jesus' ministry, gradually people either turned from him and were bored, or gradually animosity built up to even hatred. And you remember the leaders at Jerusalem despised Jesus. In fact, they thought they were serving God by plotting to murder him. So already here in Luke, only chapter 14, they're watching him. Well, what was he doing? Well, that's where our text begins. It's just verse 7, so a few verses later. He's watching them. Look at the words. When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them a parable. Okay? Pay attention to this story, he said. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor for a person more distinguishing you may have been invited. Right? Do you understand that? Now, if you have something at a wedding and you're invited, you will see that wisely they will put name cards down and you'll be assigned a certain table. Otherwise, you're going to have a mess on your hands. Everybody wants to sit, well, maybe at the bride's table. Or my best friend is the uncle of the groom and I want to sit by him. And that may not be the intention at all. A seating arrangement has been made. You know how it was with the Jews? With their low table, the most prominent was over on the left. And so the host would sit on the left, and those sitting closest to him would be the more important, right? And the ones on the far end would be the lesser important, less connected to wherever it was. So he said, when you're invited, don't take the place of honor. You may be asked to move, and now verse 9, if so, the host who invited both of you come and say to you, give this person your seat. Boy, that's humiliating when you're asked to move. And maybe by then there's only one seat left, way down on the end, right? And you walk down there, grumbling to yourself. So that's quite an interesting way for Jesus to explain this, isn't it? And you know how it goes on from there. He then turns the thing upside down on its head. So when you're invited, take the lowest place, and when your host comes, he will say, friend, move up, better place. Then you will be honored in the presence of the guests. Okay? Now that's said with a little tongue-in-cheek, isn't it? Because that's kind of phony, isn't it? I'm going to sit way here in the least important seat, just so that I get the honor of being asked to move up. But he's getting a point across, isn't he? And that's that important last verse. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled. And those who humble themselves will be exalted. Now let's apply these words to ourselves. There's a subtle meaning involved. People who are self-serving and seek recognition for what they do, they end up being humiliated. Pride goes before the fall. You know that saying. So it applies to us in our life. Do we do things to get thanked? That someone would express appreciation to us? Have you ever sort of pushed your way to get the best seat? Or the best whatever it is? Hey, admit that I. That's that old sinful nature of ours, isn't it? Are you the person who speaks up first to show how smart you are? You've got the answers? Do do you assume honor and glory for yourselves? Have you ever grumbled and complained to yourself that you weren't thanked after all that you did? Have you ever grumbled and said, I'm never going to volunteer to do that again. They don't appreciate it, or whatever. A little bit of a little boy who says, I'm mad, so I'm going to take my ball of bat and go home. Big adults have that problem sometimes too. Do you assume honor and glory for yourself? Well, I would conclude it. If you do, you won't hear the applause of it. Now let's go on. I have another question that leads naturally. How do you compare that to Christ's call for humility? And I'll show you that. That's absolutely true. I think all of you, knowing the Bible, would agree already that there are a lot of passages about humility. Let's talk about the church for a second. The church is going to do something, and it has to raise some money for the project. You know what invariably happens? Somebody with a good math mind sits down, we need this much money, we have this many people, we divide it up. Your fair share. Have you ever heard that at a meeting? My part, my fair share. That sort of makes everybody equal, right? And so if you give your fair share, this is going to succeed easily. Isn't that silly when you think about it? Because somebody has been blessed mightily in this life. There are members like that, right? And they can go beyond the fair share many times over. And then there's maybe somebody else who's just lost their job or has extreme obligations medically or with their own family. And they can't possibly meet my fair share. That's why I don't ever talk about my part. If I give 1 hour, if I clean up this, that's my fair share. Because that goes back again to that old nature of ours, of my ego. And now I have to always compare that when I'm to what Christ said. So let's do that for a second. Let's concentrate on the fact of the letter I for a second. Read that script. Isn't that the problem? The ego? By contrast, Jesus called a little child to himself and placed the child among them, and he said, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. That's a stunning verse if you think about it. That your mind would act and function like a little child. In simplicity and in humility, willing to be led, subservient. Isn't that what we find? And aren't you turned off as an adult by the little kid who is just the opposite? Arrogant and pushy and demanding. Look at what Micah wrote. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God. To walk humbly with your God. Why? That 3-letter word, S-I-M. And Jesus again said, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. And so, people who are leaders are servants. Here are 2 more. Paul wrote, for by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. So don't think too highly of yourself. That's a verse that for some of us, we have to often review. Because it's so easy for us to let our ego rise in the first place. finally, Peter's wisdom. All of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, because God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety, your cares on him, because he cares for you. Have you thought now why God or Jesus is asking you to think humility? Have you thought about that? It's not too difficult. I just want you to concentrate on your only God for a moment. You realize that God has nothing wrong. There is nothing of sin or doubt or trouble that's with God. Nothing. There are no problems with God. Nothing can be wrong. He is so holy and majestic and glorious that nothing can compare to it. And we humans couldn't possibly stand in the presence of God unless he permitted it. And I put the picture of Jesus up there before because I wanted you to concentrate on these couple of lines from Colossians. Christ is the image of the invisible God. And he writes, for by Jesus all things were created, things in heaven and earth, visible and invisible, thrones, powers, rulers, authorities. All things were created by him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. You know what he's saying to you? Jesus, as the Son of God, was also the creator of all things at the beginning. Before anything existed other than God, Jesus then began the creation. And your existence, everything that exists, the wooden tree from which this was made, all of it came about because of God. Now are you beginning to understand why Jesus talks about humility when you consider the holy character of God? Wouldn't it be silly for you or me to imagine that I could do something to obligate God to myself? What could you possibly give God that he doesn't already have? Money? Things? Nonsense. Could you ever do something, you mortals that are all going to die? Could you possibly do something to make God indebted to you? That's silliness. Therefore, doesn't it make sense, as Jesus said, that you ought to be like a little child and obediently follow, listen, learn from him? He has all things. But let's go a step further. I want you to consider the humility of Jesus. For you know that Jesus came into the world to save you. That's obvious. But how did he come? He allowed himself to become a fetus, to be born in the natural way in a mother, to grow and develop the multiplication of cells, and then to be born. That means that he had to be fed and rocked, his diaper changed. Do you understand? You talk about humility. This is the Creator God. And his mother has to teach him how to talk. Joseph, quote, his father, would have to teach him how to play the ball. Or as he got a little older, how to do some household work. Wash dishes, take out the garbage. And then maybe some carpentry skills he could assume. He had to learn language. He had to learn multiplication tables, addition, spelling, writing. He went to the synagogue school. He learned to read and write. This is the Creator God. You talk about humility. And the whole purpose down in the corner, because he is to be the Lamb of God, the sacrifice of the sin. And he knows it's coming. It's all part of the plan. And I think that the angels are applauding in heaven for his willingness to permit this to happen, that he will be rejected, spoken against, plotted to kill him. They will arrest him, they'll slap him around, and then they'll torture him. And finally, he's murdered by crucifixion. All through you. That's humility. And if you don't think there was noise on that morning when Christ rose from the dead, I am sure they were screaming and hollering, humanly speaking, as at the football stadium. The angels were cheering, Christ is risen. Sins have been paid for. I am redeemed. We can say, that's marvelous when you think it through. So my question of you, number 3, can you serve without looking for thanks? Do you know what that is? It's from the English church. Does that help you? Those are pews, pew boxes. Did you know that the origin of seating in church, first it was pews because it's so easy to use long planks, stools, and then we turned them into a little more fancy pews with backs. Well, the important people of the community, the richer people, the people who hold positions, own the factory or whatever, would want their own seat. And so they built pew boxes with little walls around them, and your name, family name, would be engraved on it. This was your place to sit. And you remember in old England there was a caste system, right? Lords and ladies and the commoners. And in the church, the commoners would sit back far on benches, or maybe stand against the wall. And that was the custom. Now, I want to correct something here. Because you sitting farther to the front doesn't make you proud or full of pride, right? Any more than you back sitters are more humble because you sit in the back. That has nothing to do with this. But it's an interesting illustration to understand how the church develops something which really is almost contradictory, isn't it, to the Spirit of Christ. The origin of the pew. But maybe a good Bible picture will help you. This came out of the old line drawings that were in our city's Bible story book years and years ago, made in Europe. That's the Pharisee. Proud. And boasting to God, I thank you, how great I am. And in the background, of course, God be merciful to me, a sinner. Just the picture helps us understand humility before our God, doesn't it? Look at what God has done for us. How can we stand in front of him? And that takes me then to my final thought. What establishes the worth of these two individuals? How about you? What is your worth? How do you measure your worth? Is it the accumulation of what you have? Well, a lot of these teenagers, I don't think have much. Some of you probably are worth some millions. How about if you're a super inventor and you're worth billions now? Is that your worth? Is it the accumulation of stuff? Is it prestige, like being elected a governor or a president or something like that? Is that what determines it? What is the value of your worth? How do you measure it? Very simple answer. Okay? You understand that? that establishes worth. You were redeemed by the Creator's own blood. You were saved by the plan of God because of his love for you and his willingness to forgive everything and to make you a child of his. Your worth is found in Jesus. It's better than $1 billion, I tell you. It's better than being elected to a high office or being a name that is in every history book. Your worth is that God did for you. Willingly, out of his love. Now you understand what you do. My, if he was willing to do that, I want to serve him in my life. And I'm not looking for thanks. It's not your appreciation that makes the difference. It's what he did for me that motivates me. And let me show that to you. You know, if I turn the page, I'm in Luke 15 now. There's 3 parables in Luke 15. You probably know that. The lost sheep, lost coin, lost son. Right in front. And every one of them ends up with a similar line. Jesus is talking to you in the Word. And what he's saying to you very clearly, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. All 3 parables of the lost end up with the rejoicing of the angels, the applause comes. Humility. May that be your blessing, my friends. Now would you